WNJN, transmitting from Montclair State.
Miguel Perez's column appears every Wednesday and Friday in The Record, North Jersey's daily intelligence report. The Record, proud supporter of NJN.
Next on Imágenes, the new epidemic of immigrant bashing in America. Saludos, welcome to Imágenes. I'm Miguel Perez. It is an instrument to measure the pulse of a nation, a window to look into its mind, the mind of North America, a barometer of the times we live in. It is an issue so controversial that many politicians avoid it like the plague. And yet, this process we call immigration is one that makes most Americans reflect on what this country is all about. They say this is a nation of immigrants who come here looking for the American dream. But during the last year, immigrant bashing has reached epidemic proportions throughout the country, from the governor of California, who has said that he wants to deny medical attention to pregnant women, to New Jersey politicians who have tried to legislate housing, employment discrimination, and others who have made the so-called immigration threat a campaign issue. Have we forgotten where we come from or who we are? Are we so hypocritical that we are now willing to deny others the same opportunities this country gave to our ancestors? This is the issue we'll be debating with a panel of immigrant rights advocates. Dennis Johnston, director of the Immigrant Rights Program of the American Friends Service Committee in Newark, Lourdes Santiago, an immigration attorney in Jersey City, and Reynaldo Guerrero, executive director of the Center for Immigrant Rights in New York. Welcome to the program. It's a pleasure having you here. Mr. Johnston, let's begin with you and let's have a conversation, first of all, about immigrant bashing and the current trend that has increased immigrant bashing in America. What is causing it? Is it the recent reports in the media about Chinese boat people, the World Trade Center bombing by immigrants, allegedly by immigrants? Or is it the economy, the recession, that has caused some Americans to think that immigrants are taking jobs away from Americans?
What we've seen is that very clearly politicians are able to score quick political points by attacking a vulnerable and population that is not politically empowered, undocumented, in many cases legal immigrants who have not yet become citizens. In addition, it seems like a number of highly publicized events such as the World Trade Center bombing, the Chinese boat that ended up in New York Harbor, and the shooting at the CIA have been manipulated in a very skillful public relations campaign by anti-immigrant groups which seek to seal the borders and reduce immigration and to close the door on what has been historically a very open policy of the United States towards immigrants.
What is causing this trend, Lourdes Santiago?
Well, I think what is causing this trend is basically people's inability to understand what the real issues are. And the problem then becomes that you have underclasses of these populations, immigrant populations. You have children's inability to attend school. You have women who are living in situations where they fear for their life. They live with husbands or lovers who are threatening them with their documents or to not get them legalized if they do not behave properly. I don't think the issue of immigration belongs at the hands of politicians if they're not going to adequately address or redress the problem.
Mr. Guerrero.
I would add that a very important factor that has contributed to the anti-immigrant sentiment and the hostilities across the United States has been some of the underlying immigration policies. For example, the employer sanctions law has been now in existence for 7 years. And what this law proposed to do was to deter illegal immigration and to improve working conditions for authorized and American workers. Well, 7 years have passed by, and we see that this law has exacerbated those anti-immigrant feelings of employers. We recently did a study in '92 in 4 major cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, to see what employers' hiring practices were like in those cities. And we found that despite increased monies by the federal government, there had been no significant reduction in discrimination. And so I see the employer sanctions law as being a very important law that contributes to this anti-immigrant frenzy, especially at the workplace.
Well, it also leads, Mr. Johnson, does it not, to more exploitation of workers by coercion, by intimidating the workers? Employer can say, well, you know, I can get in trouble with immigration. You're going to have to work for a lower wage because I'm taking a chance here. Or threatening the employee with calling immigration if he misbehaves or doesn't do what the employer wants. In other words, sweatshop operators are now more able to manipulate the immigrant worker.
I think that's precisely the point that Ronaldo was trying to make, is that immigration laws, and especially employer sanctions, have sought to deny a fundamental human right of all people, which is to live and work in dignity, to support their families, and to be able to provide food and shelter for those families. And clearly we have seen an increase in exploitation. Workers who work for a week or 2 weeks, or in some cases a month, who end up being owed thousands of dollars by a contractor who they only perhaps know the first name or have a vehicle license plate number. One morning the contractor no longer shows up. I think very clearly the undocumented workers are very key to this society right now, as far as being a cheap labor force with the economic restructuring in America, with good union jobs going south to Mexico, and where companies can move wherever they like. And at the same time, you see this country trying to control workers who are trying to seek the best advantage for themselves.
And yet, when this law was passed in 1986, there were provisions in there for repealing the law if it did not work, if it led to more discrimination. The General Accounting Office did a study and found that it actually does lead to more discrimination. Congress has not done anything to repeal it.
That's correct. In 1990, the General Accounting Office revealed in its study that nearly 20% of employers nationwide were engaging in unlawful discriminatory practices. And it did find that those bearing the burden of this discrimination happened to be Latinos, Caribbeans, Asians, people who look foreign. I think another...
Puerto Ricans who are
Puerto Ricans as well.
American citizens from the moment they are born. And Lourdes, you're Puerto Rican. It's happening to Puerto Ricans too, where they just look foreign. They go to apply for a job and automatically they are discriminated because they assume that they may be an illegal alien.
That's correct. And we have Puerto Ricans who don't understand why that is happening. You know, across the board, employers are obligated to ask every employee seeking employment for documentation. The problem with employer sanctions also is that the government did not take that extra step to make sure that employers were aware of the law. There was a campaign, clearly, but it wasn't enough. You still have employers enforcing the law whichever way they see fit.
And how does this apply to women? Because I understand that some employers are also asking for sexual favors.
That's correct. I think that the sexual harassment problem that's gone on generally, you know, against women is exacerbated when you talk about undocumented women. When the employer sanctions law passed, you had a grandfather clause. Any employee who had been at that job prior to the enactment of the law in 1986 basically was okay at that job. The problem being is that that individual leaves that job, then they are subject to employer sanctions. Many women from here to California are subjected to this problem. What happens is, if they're afraid of leaving that job knowing that they will be subject to employer sanctions and the documentation requirements, employers, of course, are taking advantage of this, knowing that these women are vulnerable. They're getting low wages, they're working in unfair conditions, and on top of that, they're being subjected to sexual harassment.
Miguel, I'd just like to add what Lourdes had to say. We frequently receive phone calls from employers after the Immigration Service has conducted a raid on their workplace. And many times, I mean, this is the flip side of the burden that is placed on employers as a result of this law. And generally, I had a call this morning, and the employer will say, I have these great workers. They've been with me for 5 or 6 years. They really appreciate the job. They're steady. They're stable. I have no complaints whatsoever about them. And now, because of this raid, 3 of them went back to Mexico, and the other 3 are being deported by immigration. What can I do? I mean, you have a case where I can't find workers, they tell us. I cannot find U.S. citizen workers to do this job. I had no idea they were undocumented.
Well, that's another issue that I wanted to deal with on this program, and that is the fact that they say that the immigrants, illegal immigrants, are taking jobs away from Americans. And I know what you guys are going to say, but I want you to say it on this program because I've dealt with this issue in the past, and what I've seen in the studies is that it's the other way around. It's that these immigrants are taking jobs, as you just said, that Americans don't want. Mr. Guerrero?
Well, in New York City, for example, New York City is a gateway to immigration. In the 80s, close to 1 million immigrants came into New York City. This particular group of immigrants has contributed much to the economy in New York City. It's contributed much to the garment industry, to the restaurant industry. Many of the immigrants take manual jobs that Americans will not work. We've got day laborers, for example, who are doing very, very hard work. You know, work that Americans don't want to perform.
Or in the kitchen of a restaurant in New York City, that happens quite often.
Correct.
Who are these immigrant bashers of 1993, especially during the last year? Are they people who base their opinion on misconceptions, on stereotypes, on racist misconceptions, perhaps? Do they think that that the world is sending too many blacks and Latinos and Asians to this country and not enough white Europeans? Is that what's happening?
Well, I think the reality is that the fabric of America has been changing and has been changing historically, but I think within the last 20 years it's been changing very rapidly. I know that people are realizing by the year 2000 the Latino population will be the primary community in the United States. That means 2 languages. It means 2 cultures. It means many cultures. And I think that there is a general fear of change, of this difference. And we see it in our educational institutions who are gearing up to make sure that we provide a workforce for these corporations that make America, that want to make America work. However, that means basically dealing with issues of cultural diversity, dealing with issues of language. And I think that people become challenged. They become challenged because they have to change. They have to provide a difference. And it's amazing to me that people in California would dare oppose the fact that street signs are in Spanish when the largest populations in those communities are of Spanish-speaking.
Now, are they able, Mr. Johnston, to differentiate between a legal and an illegal alien, or do they assume that all aliens or all immigrants are illegal? I understand that 7 out of 10 are legal, but I see a lot of people believing that almost all of them are illegal.
I think very clearly that's a very important, when you talk about fears and misconceptions and myths, the fact that 7 or 8 out of every 10 immigrants who enter the United States are legal immigrants, nearly 80%. I mean, people look at Latinos or Asians and they say, these are blatantly obvious illegal aliens, as campaign literature recently proclaimed them. And I believe you asked the question, well, how do you know that they're blatantly, obviously illegal? Mm-hmm. Do they carry around a sign that says, I don't have a green card? And another factor is that there are perhaps 3 to 4 million undocumented people in this country currently out of a population of more than 250 million. That's less than 2% of the population of this nation. It's a very small number.
We see very little mention in the news media when immigration is dealt with in the newspapers and television about the contributions that immigrants make to this country. We only see the negative side, but I'd like to hear from you something about what they contribute. I mean, you see they're living off the taxpayers' money, and in fact, immigrants pay taxes too. Mr. Guerrero.
Correct, yeah. Immigrants make very many contributions to society. Economically, there are parts in New York City, for example, the Sunset Park area, Jackson, Queens, where new immigrants have come in and have revitalized those economies. Economies that had been depressed back in the 70s when there was a flight of Americans out into the suburbs. Places in the city were left depressed. New immigrants have come in, are revitalizing these parts of the city.
Traditionally, the government reacts to immigration issues as a stopgap measure, temporary quick stop things, instead of a permanent solution. And that was the complaint for many years about the Reagan and Bush administrations. And there was a lot of optimism among immigrant rights advocates like yourselves about what Clinton will do when he came into office. And then one of his major campaign promises was to do something for the Haitian refugees. How do you feel about Mr. Clinton now that he basically betrayed that promise? Mr. Johnston.
I think he's going back to the ways of the 1980s where you had a double standard, and we were full of a great deal of hope that the Refugee Act of 1980 would be fairly implemented and that President Clinton would keep his campaign promise to protect Haitian refugees. And he has sent out a signal to the world that you can not only go back on campaign promises, but it's not important to offer protection to refugees, and also that some refugees are good refugees and others are refugees we'd really rather not deal with. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been a tremendous betrayal to the immigrant and refugee community and to the Haitian people in this context.
After the World Trade Center, the alleged Islamic involvement in the World Trade Center bombing, and after the Chinese boat people, 8 of them, drowned off the coast of New York City, Mr. Clinton immediately named a new director of the Immigration Service, and then immediately came up with a new policy. The new policy was to expedite the process for excluding political refugees to this country. He wanted to do it within 5 days, which sometimes it takes a year or more to process political refugees. How do you feel about that? Isn't that violating the civil rights of these people and perhaps even endangering their lives if they are sent back to their countries?
I think summary exclusion generally is always a problem, particularly when it's part of a reaction and not part of an action. And in this situation, clearly you're putting power in the hands of officials who may or may not have the ability or the knowledge to make determinations that may lead to a fair determination. When you have summary exclusion proceedings, you have individuals that would basically be turned away at the port of entry and perhaps turned away and returned to homelands where they will be killed.
Or in the case of the Haitian refugees, turned away at sea before they even get here.
That's correct.
That is a situation that Clinton has not been able to absolutely explain or at least resolve. Mr. Guerrero, what is the Center for Immigrant Rights in New York, for example, doing about the situation with Haitian refugees, with so many of them in the city?
Yes, well, we at the Center for Immigrant Rights, we have recently started a new project for workers' rights, and we have opened an office. Well, we are working with CAMBA, which is an immigrant organization in Brooklyn, in Flatbush, where there is a large Haitian community. Mm-hmm. And we have a paralegal who is working in providing workplace rights education and assisting members of the Caribbean, it's a largely Caribbean community, with complaints that are being filed with the Department of Labor for back wages, for non-payment of wages. Our work is mostly with the Haitian community in that respect.
There was a lot of optimism that once Aristide was restored to power, there would be no need for more Haitians to come to this country, but that has sort of been paralyzed or frozen for quite a while now, and the Haitians still have the need to flee their country because there's still a dictatorship there.
I think I think there's a general misconception that when situations change in the home country, that all of a sudden it's safe to return. Mm-hmm. Governments don't change overnight. And I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that if we are returning individuals to their homeland, that we return them to safe harbors.
A good case in point would be the Salvadorans or the Nicaraguans who are still unsure as to whether they should or shouldn't go back home.
That's correct.
Especially with the death squads resurrecting in El Salvador, Mr. Johnston. I'm sure you're dealing with a lot of Salvadorans here in New Jersey.
I think that goes back to the point we were making before about how immigration policy is so frequently short-term and reactive in nature. And we look at the 1980s where the U.S. government sent $6 billion to the Salvadoran government in military aid. 75,000 Salvadorans were killed, many at the hands of right-wing death squads linked to the government. And during that same period, more than 1 million Salvadoran refugees came to the United States. But people, for some reason, they see the immigration or the refugee problem once they see the Salvadorans in their communities here, but they forget about the fact that the United States sent the guns and sent the bullets that caused the war in El Salvador.
Well, immigrant bashing, again, reached the state of New Jersey during the last year. Mr. Johnston, you've been very involved in the situation in Palisades Park, and I want you to tell us what that was about, because there was certain local legislation there that wanted to discriminate against illegal refugees or from Guatemala, mainly, from what I understand.
In the situation of Palisades Park, there is a community of about 200 Guatemalan day laborers, mostly men who have been forced to leave their families, their wives and children behind in Guatemala, to seek work as day laborers. And what we've seen is that when you have immigrant populations in what had been perhaps homogeneous communities in the suburbs throughout New Jersey, where you have a very visible presence, in this case of Latino immigrants standing on the street corner, in some cases there has been a backlash against these immigrants, which has been manifested in a number of ways.
We should explain that a day laborer is someone who stands at a street corner early in the morning waiting for an employer to come pick them up and take them to work. So these are people who are standing on the street but looking for jobs, looking for work, not loitering, and not selling drugs, not trying to harm anyone, but actually looking for a way to make a real earning or a real living for their family, or to help their family, or to support their family back in Guatemala. And what did the city of Palisades Park try to do to them?
What we've seen is various measures taken by Palisades Park. There have been sweeps by the police where workers have been forced off the streets, where they've been threatened, they've been shouted at through police speakers and bullhorns, they've been physically moved off the street corners. There has been enforcement of a municipal loitering statute, which was just recently in a court case brought by one of the Guatemalans who was charged with loitering while standing on a street corner waiting for work.
You helped him get a lawyer.
American Friends Service Committee and the American Civil Liberties Union, working together, were able to challenge this loitering statute, and the judge agreed that the statute was unconstitutional under state law and dismissed the charges. And since that time, the police have very much backed off and have allowed the day laborers to go about their business of trying to find work and live in dignity.
At the same time, nearby, also in Bergen County, in Park Ridge, during the November elections, 2 Republicans ran for office and made immigrant bashing the main campaign issue, when in fact in Park Ridge there are very few immigrants to begin with. But they were using that phobia, that xenophobia, to make a campaign issue out of it and hopefully try to get elected. They lost.
In that case, the campaign strategy by the 2 Republican council candidates backfired in a very strong way on them, and they ended up losing the election. The mayor of Park Ridge, Richard Mancinelli, wrote a very strong rebuke to this xenophobic and racist campaign literature, where he said that who are we to decide the ethnic or the racial composition of our communities, and since when do we decide who do we let in and who do we keep out? He said, this is a civil rights issue, and we as municipal authorities do not have a right to enforce federal immigration law. He took a very strong stance, and in the post-election period, right around the holiday season, he held a candlelight vigil for harmony and goodwill, where he brought together religious leaders and community leaders, and approximately 300 residents of Park Ridge came forth and participated in this vigil. And very clearly we see how municipal leaders and religious leaders can play a constructive role in promoting tolerance, reconciliation, understanding, and diversity in a situation which must be addressed and is being addressed in different ways in different communities.
Mr. Guerrero, in the city of New York, for a long time, the city would refuse to cooperate with the immigration service as far as turning over illegal aliens who came to the city for help. Is that still the case there? Because it's changing in different municipalities throughout the country, where now the immigrant bashing has led to politicians trying to cooperate more often with the immigration service and turn in the immigrants who come for city services.
Yeah, in New York City, there currently is in existence a sanctuary law. It's entitled the Mayor's Executive Order Number 124, which prohibits any city agency or police officer to report any undocumented person to immigration authorities unless he or she is suspected of engaging in criminal activity. This particular executive order is still in existence, and although it's in existence, it hasn't always worked. We've had some problems similar to those problems that day laborers face here in New Jersey, in New York City. We at the Center for Immigrants' Rights currently have an organizing project where we're providing organizing and educational assistance, technical assistance, to over 1,500 day laborers who are mostly Latino from Central America, Mexico, and South America. Now, we've had problems in various boroughs of New York City where some police officers were violating this executive order and were harassing some of the workers, demanding to see green cards. We've stepped in and were able to come to an understanding. We spoke with the police precincts, and we've even conducted workshops.
Do you see these things happening in Jersey City as an immigration attorney? Are you confronting this kind of situation with municipalities yourself?
Within the last couple of months, I've gotten several calls from individuals who have been subjected to raids right outside of their jobs. And what they are actually doing is arresting them prior to going into the job, and therefore circumventing the rights that employees have and employers have inside the job site.
During this year, 1994, we hope that we don't see the same reoccurrence of the things we saw for immigrants in 1993. After all, these are times to remember those beautiful words on the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Some people are just yearning to be cruel. Others are just selfish. They believe the Golden Gate should have been closed immediately after they crossed. But Miss Liberty is still there, holding up her lamp, and it's up to us, all of us, to keep the door golden. I'm Miguel Perez, and I'll see you next week on another edition of Imágenes.
Miguel Perez's column appears every Wednesday and Friday in The Record, North Jersey's daily intelligence report. The Record, proud supporter of NJN.